The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Riverside County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Judge Richard Mansfield adjusted his black robes as he prepared for another day on the bench. At 58, he had built a reputation as one of the toughest judges in the district. His sharp tongue and zero-tolerance approach had earned him both respect and fear from the lawyers who appeared before him. Mansfield took pride in running his courtroom like a military operation. He demanded punctuality, proper dress, and absolute respect for his authority. Those who failed to meet his standards faced swift consequences. In his 15 years as a judge, he had held countless people in contempt, issued hefty fines, and never hesitated to remind everyone in his courtroom who was in charge. The judge's office walls were lined with awards and commendations. His law degree from Harvard hung prominently behind his desk, alongside photos of him with various politicians and legal dignitaries. Mansfield had worked hard to climb the ladder of success, starting as a prosecutor fresh out of law school, then moving into private practice where he made his fortune defending wealthy clients. His appointment to the bench had been the crown jewel of his career. As he reviewed the morning's docket, Mansfield noticed a simple traffic violation case scheduled for 9:30. The defendant was listed as Michael Torres, charged with driving with an expired license and failure to appear at a previous hearing. The judge barely glanced at the details. Traffic court was routine business, usually handled quickly with standard fines and stern warnings. What Mansfield didn't know was that Michael Torres had been trying to appear in court for months. The 26-year-old veteran had been deployed overseas when his original court date arrived. Despite filing proper military deployment paperwork through his attorney, the court system had somehow lost track of his case. Multiple letters from his commanding officer explaining his situation had been filed, but they never made it to the judge's attention. Torres had returned from his deployment in Afghanistan just 2 weeks earlier. The young man had served 3 tours of duty as a combat medic, saving lives under fire and earning several commendations for bravery. He had witnessed things no person should ever see, lost friends to roadside bombs, and carried wounded soldiers to safety while bullets flew overhead. The transition back to civilian life was proving more difficult than any battlefield he had faced. The veteran had been staying with his elderly mother in a small apartment across town. His military pay had stopped, and finding work was proving challenging. The expired license issue stemmed from his deployment. He had been unable to renew it while serving overseas, and the backlog at the DMV meant he couldn't get an immediate appointment upon his return. Torres had borrowed his mother's car that morning to drive to the courthouse. He wore his only decent civilian clothes, a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt, and khaki pants that were a size too big. His military bearing was still evident in his straight posture and precise movements, but his clothes hung loosely on his frame. The stress of readjusting to civilian life and worrying about money had caused him to lose weight. In the courthouse hallway, Torres sat quietly on a wooden bench, clutching a folder containing his military deployment orders, discharge papers, and letters from his commanding officer. He had hoped these documents would help explain his situation to the judge. The young veteran's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the hypervigilance that many combat veterans experience. Loud noises and crowded spaces still put him on edge, and the courthouse was both. At 9:30 sharp, the bailiff called Torres's name. He stood and walked toward the defendant's table, his movements careful and measured. Judge Mansfield looked up from his papers with the bored expression of someone who had seen thousands of similar cases. He didn't bother to review the file thoroughly, assuming this was just another deadbeat trying to avoid responsibility. "Mr. Torres," the judge began, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "You're charged with driving on expired license and failure to appear. How do you plead?" Torres stood straight, his military training evident in his posture. "Your Honor, I'd like to explain the circumstances. I asked for your plea, not your excuses," Mansfield interrupted sharply. "Guilty or not guilty?" The veteran's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Not guilty, Your Honor." I have documentation that explains, Mr. Torres, this court doesn't have time for elaborate stories. You either had a valid license or you didn't. You either appeared for your court date or you didn't. The facts seem pretty clear to me. The judge's tone was dismissive, and several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Torres opened his folder and took a step forward. Your Honor, I was deployed overseas with the Army. I have my deployment orders here, and letters from my commanding officer explaining why I couldn't appear. Oh, here we go, Judge Mansfield said, rolling his eyes theatrically. The military excuse. Do you think that uniform gives you special privileges? Do you think you're above the law because you played soldier for a while? The courtroom fell silent. The phrase "played soldier" hung in the air like a physical blow. Torres's face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Other veterans in the gallery, there for their own cases, stared in disbelief. Court reporters looked up from their machines, unsure they had heard correctly. Your Honor, Torres said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I was performing my duty to my country. Your duty? Mansfield leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Your duty was to follow the law and appear in court. But instead, you decided to go play war games overseas and ignore your legal obligations here at home. The words hit Torres like physical punches. He had saved lives under fire, had held dying soldiers in his arms, had sacrificed years of his life in service to his country. To have it dismissed as playing war games was more painful than any wound he had received in combat. I have documentation, Torres repeated, his voice barely controlled. If you would just look at my deployment orders, I don't need to look at anything, the judge snapped. I've heard enough sob stories from people trying to get out of their responsibilities. You missed your court date, you drove illegally, and now you want sympathy because you wore a uniform. Well, Mr. Torres, this isn't a military court, and I'm not impressed by your service record. The public defender assigned to Torres's case started to stand, recognizing that the situation was spiraling out of control. She had seen Judge Mansfield's temperamental outburst before, but this seemed particularly cruel and unjustified. Your Honor, the lawyer began, perhaps we could review the defendant's military documentation. Ms. Patterson, your client had multiple opportunities to handle this properly. Instead, he chose to ignore his legal obligations and hide behind his military service. I'm tired of people thinking military service is a get-out-of-jail-free card. Torres stood perfectly still, his military training the only thing keeping him from responding as his emotions demanded. He thought about his fallen comrades, about the flag-draped coffins he had helped carry, about the families who would never see their loved ones again. He thought about the nights he still woke up in cold sweats, reliving the sounds of incoming mortars and the screams of wounded soldiers. Furthermore, Judge Mansfield continued, clearly enjoying his position of power, I find it offensive that you would come into my courtroom in wrinkled clothes, looking like you just rolled out of bed, and expect special treatment because you spent some time overseas. This is a court of law, not a military barracks. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom. Several spectators shook their heads in disgust, while others looked around nervously, unsure of what they were witnessing. Court staff members exchanged glances, knowing they were seeing something that would likely have consequences. Torres's mother, who had been sitting in the gallery, began to cry quietly. She had raised her son to respect authority and to serve his country with honor. Watching him being humiliated for that very service was breaking her heart. She wanted to speak up, to tell the judge about the nightmares her son still had, about how hard he was trying to readjust to civilian life, about the sacrifices he had made for strangers who would never know his name. I'm fining you $500 for the expired license, Judge Mansfield announced, and another $500 for failure to appear. And Mr. Torres, let me give you some advice. The next time you appear in my courtroom, show some respect for the institution and dress appropriately. Your military service doesn't excuse slovenly appearance or disrespect for the law. The veteran stood in stunned silence. $1,000 fine when he had no job and no income. More importantly, The complete dismissal of his service and sacrifice cut deeper than any financial penalty. He had served his country honorably, had been willing to die for the very system that was now treating him with such contempt. Unknown to Judge Mansfield, several people in the courtroom were recording the proceedings on their phones. Court rules typically prohibited recording, but security had been lax that morning, and the judge's outrageous behavior had prompted multiple people to document what they were witnessing. Among those recording was Sarah Chun, a local reporter who happened to be in court covering a different story. She had initially planned to leave after her case was called, but Torres' situation had caught her attention. As a journalist, she recognized a significant story when she saw one. More importantly, as the daughter of a veteran, she was personally offended by the judge's treatment of the young soldier. In the back row sat James Wheeler, a retired Army colonel who was in court supporting a friend facing charges. Wheeler had commanded troops in 3 different conflicts and had seen young men and women like Torres risk everything for their country. The judge's comments made his blood boil, and he was already planning his next steps before the hearing was even over. Also present was Maria Santos, a social worker who specialized in helping veterans transition to civilian life. She had seen countless young veterans struggle with the challenges Torres was facing, and she recognized the signs of someone dealing with post-traumatic stress and readjustment issues. The judge's treatment of this vulnerable young man was not just cruel, it was potentially dangerous. "Court is adjourned," Judge Mansfield announced, banging his gavel with obvious satisfaction. He had once again demonstrated his authority and shown everyone in his courtroom that he was not to be trifled with. As far as he was concerned, he had handled another routine case and taught an important lesson about respect for the law. Torres remained standing at the defendant's table for several moments after the judge left the bench. His public defender approached him, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger on his behalf. "Michael, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "That was completely inappropriate. We can file an appeal, and we should definitely file a complaint about the judge's conduct." The veteran nodded slowly, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about his friends who had died, believing they were protecting something worthwhile, something noble. He was wondering if their sacrifice had meant anything at all, if this was how their country treated those who survived to come home. As Torres gathered his papers and prepared to leave, several people approached him. Colonel Wheeler introduced himself and offered his business card. "Son, what happened here today was wrong, and it's not going to stand," he said firmly. "You served with honor, and you deserve to be treated with respect." Sarah Chin also approached, identifying herself as a reporter. "Mr. Torres, would you be willing to speak with me about what just happened? I think people need to know about this." The veteran looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of people who had witnessed his humiliation. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed embarrassed to have been present for such a spectacle. A few appeared angry on his behalf. "I just want to go home," Torres said quietly. "I just want to put this behind me and move on with my life." But even as he said the words, Torres knew that moving on wouldn't be that simple. The judge's words had reopened wounds that were still healing from his military service. The dismissal of his sacrifice and the mockery of his service felt like a betrayal by the very system he had sworn to protect. As the courtroom emptied, none of those present could have predicted the chain of events that had just been set in motion. Judge Mansfield's moment of arrogance and cruelty had been witnessed by the wrong people at the wrong time. Within hours, the consequences of his actions would begin to unfold in ways he never could have imagined. The veteran walked out of the courthouse into the bright morning sunshine, his mother beside him, both of them silent and shaken. Behind them, phones were already buzzing with messages, emails were being composed, and wheels were being set in motion that would soon change everything. Judge Richard Mansfield had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and he didn't even know it yet. Within 2 hours of leaving the courthouse, Michael Torres found himself sitting in a small coffee shop across the street from the local newspaper office, facing Sarah Chun and a digital recorder. The reporter had convinced him to tell his story, explaining that what had happened wasn't just an injustice to him personally, but a disservice to every veteran who had ever served. Torres's hands wrapped around his coffee cup as he spoke quietly about his 3 deployments to Afghanistan. He described the roadside bombs that had torn through his convoy, the nights spent treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire, and the friends he had lost to war. His voice remained steady, but Chun could see the pain in his eyes as he recounted memories that were still fresh and raw. "I never asked for special treatment," Torres explained. "I just wanted the chance to show the court my deployment orders. I wanted to explain why I couldn't appear when I was supposed to. I wasn't trying to get out of anything. I was willing to pay the fine for the expired license. I just wanted to be treated with basic respect." Chin took notes as Torres spoke, but she was also studying the young man across from her. She could see the military bearing in his posture, the way he chose his words carefully, the respect he still showed for authority, even after being humiliated. This wasn't someone trying to dodge responsibility. This was a soldier trying to navigate a system that seemed determined to punish him for serving his country. "What hurt the most?" Chin asked gently. Torres was quiet for a long moment. "When he said I was playing soldier and playing war games. I thought about my friend Martinez, who stepped on an IED trying to save a wounded Afghan child. I thought about Rodriguez, who took shrapnel in the chest while evacuating civilians. These guys died, believing they were protecting something important. To have their sacrifice, our sacrifice, dismissed as playing games." His voice trailed off. Meanwhile, across town, Colonel James Wheeler was on the phone in his home office, surrounded by military memorabilia and photos from his 30-year career. He had already made 3 calls, one to his contact at the State Veteran Affairs Office, one to the American Legion Post Commander, and one to a friend who worked for a veterans' rights organization. "Jim, this is unacceptable," Wheeler was saying to his contact at the Veterans Affairs Office. "I was sitting right there. I heard every word. This judge needs to be held accountable for his actions." Wheeler had served in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He had commanded young soldiers like Torres and had seen firsthand the sacrifices they made. The idea that any of his former troops might face such treatment from the very system they had sworn to protect infuriated him. "I want this story to reach every veteran organization in the state," Wheeler continued. "This kid served 3 tours. 3 tours. And he gets treated like garbage because he was deployed when his court date came up. It's disgraceful." Wheeler's wife, Patricia, entered the office carrying a cup of coffee. She had been married to a soldier for 35 years and understood the military culture better than most civilians. She had also raised 3 children while her husband was deployed, managing family crises and medical emergencies alone while he served overseas. "How can we help this young man?" she asked after Wheeler finished his call. "We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened," Wheeler replied. "And we're going to make sure that Judge faces consequences for his actions." Back at the courthouse, news of the morning's events was spreading through the building like wildfire. Court clerks whispered in hallways, bailiffs shared details during their breaks, and other judges heard second-hand accounts of Mansfield's outburst. Many were embarrassed by their colleagues' behavior, knowing it reflected poorly on the entire judicial system. Judge Martha Rodriguez, who had chambers down the hall from Mansfield, was particularly troubled by what she heard. Rodriguez had served as a military lawyer before becoming a judge, and she regularly presided over veteran treatment courts designed to help former service members who struggled with substance abuse or mental health issues after their military service. This is exactly the kind of treatment that drives veterans away from seeking help, Rodriguez confided to her clerk. "We should be supporting these young people, not tearing them down when they're already struggling." Rodriguez had seen countless young veterans dealing with the challenges Torres faced: difficulty finding employment, trouble adjusting to civilian life, financial struggles, and the invisible wounds of combat that didn't heal quickly. She knew that many veterans already felt alienated from the civilian world, and Mansfield's treatment would only reinforce those feelings. At the local Veterans Administration office, where the incident was spreading through email chains and phone calls, caseworkers who helped veterans with legal issues were outraged by what they heard. "Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who treated combat veterans with PTSD, was particularly concerned about the potential impact on Torres and other veterans who might hear about the incident. This is the kind of public humiliation that can trigger serious mental health crises, Dr. Foster explained to her supervisor. Veterans already struggle with feelings of being unwanted or unappreciated when they return home. Something like this can push someone who's already vulnerable over the edge. Foster had treated hundreds of combat veterans over her 15-year career. She had seen strong, capable soldiers reduced to tears by much smaller slights than what Torres had endured. The public nature of his humiliation made it even worse. Not only had he been disrespected, but it had happened in front of a room full of strangers. While Torres was still being interviewed by Chun, his phone began buzzing with calls and messages. Word had spread through social media, and veterans groups across the region were reaching out to offer support. The local American Legion Post wanted to provide legal assistance. The veterans of foreign wars offered to help with his financial situation. A group of Marine veterans said they wanted to organize a peaceful protest at the courthouse. Torres felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but also uncomfortable with the attention. He had never sought publicity and didn't want to become a symbol or a cause. He just wanted to pay his fine, get his license renewed, and move on with his life. "I appreciate everyone's support," he told one caller, "but I'm not looking to become some kind of poster boy for veterans' rights. I just want to be treated fairly." But the story was taking on a life of its own. Sarah Chun had published her initial article online within hours of their interview, and it was already being shared thousands of times on social media. The headline read, "Local judge calls veteran service playing soldier during court hearing." The article included quotes from Torres's interview, background on his military service, and context about the challenges many veterans face when returning to civilian life. Chun had also reached out to legal experts and veterans advocates for their reactions to the judge's behavior. "This is exactly the kind of treatment that undermines public confidence in our judicial system," said Professor Linda Walsh, who taught legal ethics at the State University. "Judges are supposed to be impartial and respectful to all who appear before them. Personal attacks and dismissive comments about military service have no place in any courtroom." By evening, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. Television reporters were calling the courthouse for comment, but Judge Mansfield had left early and was not responding to requests for interviews. The court administration office issued a brief statement saying they were looking into the matter, but declined to comment further. At his home in an upscale suburb, Judge Mansfield was unaware of the growing controversy. He had left the courthouse after his morning session and spent the afternoon playing golf at his country club. His phone had been turned off during his round, and he hadn't bothered to check his messages when he returned home. Mansfield's wife, Elizabeth, was hosting a charity committee meeting in their living room when the first news report appeared on the local evening news. The women were discussing their upcoming fundraiser when the television in the background caught their attention. "Tonight at 6, we have an exclusive report about a local judge who publicly humiliated a military veteran during a court hearing earlier today," the news anchor announced. Judge Richard Mansfield of Riverside County Court allegedly called the veteran's military service playing soldier and dismissed his deployment to Afghanistan as war games. The room fell silent as the report continued, featuring an interview with Torres and reaction from local veterans groups. Elizabeth Mansfield watched in horror as her husband's actions were broadcast to thousands of viewers. The other committee members glanced at her sympathetically, unsure what to say. "I'm sure there's more to the story than what they're reporting," one woman offered weakly, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. When Mansfield finally checked his phone that evening, he found 47 missed calls and dozens of text messages. His voicemail was full of angry messages from fellow lawyers, veterans groups, and citizens who had seen the news reports. Many of the messages were unprintable, but the general theme was clear. His behavior had been unacceptable and would not be forgotten. The judge's first instinct was defensive. He had been tough on defendants for years, and no one had complained before. He convinced himself that this was just political correctness run amok, that people were too sensitive about military service. In his mind, he had simply held someone accountable for failing to follow the law. But as he read through the messages and saw the growing media coverage, Mansfield began to realize that this situation was different. The story wasn't going away, and the reaction was far more intense than he had anticipated. Veterans groups were calling for his resignation. Legal ethics experts were questioning his fitness for the bench. Social media was flooded with angry comments about his behavior. That night, Torres lay in his narrow bed in his mother's apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the day's events. The sounds of helicopters in the distance triggered flashbacks to his deployment, and he found himself reliving combat memories that usually only surfaced in nightmares. His mother knocked softly on his door. "Mijo, are you okay? Do you want to talk?" Torres appreciated her concern, but he couldn't find the words to explain how he felt. The judge's dismissal of his service had struck at the core of his identity. For 3 years, being a soldier had defined him. It had given him purpose, pride, and a sense of belonging. To have that experience minimized and mocked felt like losing a part of himself. "I'm fine, Mom," he called back, not wanting to worry her more than she already was. But Torres wasn't fine. The judge's words had opened wounds he thought were healing. He found himself questioning whether his service had meant anything at all. If this was how his country viewed his sacrifice, what had been the point of everything he had endured? As midnight approached, support continued to pour in from across the country. Veterans organizations were mobilizing, planning protests, and letter-writing campaigns. Legal advocacy groups were researching options for filing formal complaints against the judge. Social media campaigns with hashtags like #RespectOurVeterans and #JudgeMansfield were trending in multiple states. The story had struck a nerve with a public already concerned about how veterans were treated when they returned home from combat deployments. Stories of veteran suicide, homelessness, and struggles with PTSD had made many Americans sensitive to issues of respect and support for those who had served. Judge Mansfield, still trying to downplay the significance of the controversy, had no idea that his world was about to change completely. The wheels of accountability were already in motion, and forces beyond his control were gathering momentum. Tomorrow would bring consequences he had never imagined, and his comfortable life of privilege and authority was about to face its biggest challenge. The young veteran he had humiliated was about to receive justice in ways neither of them could have predicted. Judge Richard Mansfield woke up the next morning to find protesters already gathering outside his suburban home. By 7 a.m., 24 veterans and their supporters had assembled on the sidewalk, carrying signs that read, "Respect our veterans," and "Judge Mansfield must resign." The demonstrators were peaceful but determined, and their presence sent shockwaves through the exclusive neighborhood. Mansfield's wife, Elizabeth, peered through the bedroom curtains, her face pale with anxiety. "Richard, there are people with signs in our front yard. The neighbors are starting to come outside to see what's happening." The judge looked out the window and felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just a news story anymore. It had become a movement. Veterans from multiple conflicts were represented in the crowd. Some wore their military service hats. Others displayed unit patches on their jackets. A few were in wheelchairs, bearing the visible scars of their service. Among the protesters was Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had lost her left leg to an IED in Iraq. She sat in her wheelchair holding a sign that read, "I didn't lose my leg playing games." Next to her stood Corporal David Kim, whose Purple Heart medal was pinned to his jacket. He had driven 3 hours from Los Angeles after seeing the news coverage. "This isn't about one judge or one veteran," Gonzalez told a reporter who had arrived to cover the demonstration. "This is about respect for everyone who has worn the uniform. When you attack one of us for serving, you attack all of us." Inside the house, Mansfield's phone was ringing constantly. His wife had stopped answering after the first dozen calls, which ranged from death threats to demands for his resignation. The judge's children, both adults living in other states, had been calling frantically after seeing their father's name trending on social media. "Dad, "What were you thinking?" his son Mark had asked during heated phone conversation the night before. "I have friends who served in Afghanistan. How am I supposed to explain to them that my father called their service playing soldier?" Mansfield had tried to defend his actions, claiming he was just enforcing the law and maintaining order in his courtroom. But even his own family wasn't buying his explanations. His daughter Lisa had been even more direct. "You humiliated that young man for serving his country. There's no excuse for that." Meanwhile, the formal complaint process was moving faster than anyone had expected. The State Judicial Conduct Board had received over 300 complaints within 24 hours of the incident. Colonel Wheeler had submitted a detailed account along with the contact information of multiple witnesses. Sarah Chun had provided the audio recording she had captured during the court hearing. Judge Martha Rodriguez, who served on the Judicial Conduct Review Committee, was among those reviewing the complaints. She had watched the news coverage with growing anger and embarrassment about her colleagues' behavior. "This is exactly the kind of conduct that undermines public trust in our entire judicial system," Rodriguez told the committee chairman during an emergency conference call. "We can't allow this to stand without serious consequences." The committee chairman, retired Judge Harold Stevens, agreed. "I've been on this bench for 25 years, and I've never seen anything this blatantly inappropriate. We need to move quickly on this investigation." What made Mansfield's situation even worse was the timing of his outburst. The incident had occurred during Military Appreciation Month, when communities across the country were holding special events to honor veterans. The contrast between the nation's proclaimed respect for military service and Mansfield's public humiliation of a veteran couldn't have been starker. At the Veterans Administration Hospital across town, Dr. Amanda Foster was dealing with the fallout from the incident in a more personal way. 3 of her patients had called her office after seeing the news, expressing feelings of betrayal and abandonment by the civilian community they had served. "Dr. Foster, if this is how they really feel about us, what's the point?" one former Marine had asked during an emergency phone session. "Maybe we were just fools for believing we were protecting something worthwhile." Foster had spent hours on the phone, providing crisis counseling and reassurance to veterans who were struggling with their own feelings of alienation after seeing how Torres had been treated. She knew that this incident would have ripple effects throughout the veteran community for months to come. "One judge's ignorance doesn't represent how most Americans feel about your service," she told each caller, but she could hear the doubt in their voices. The story had also caught the attention of national veterans organizations. The American Legion's national commander issued a statement calling for Mansfield's immediate removal from the bench. The Veterans of Foreign Wars announced they were considering filing a federal civil rights lawsuit. The Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America launched an online petition demanding justice for Torres. "This kind of treatment of our veterans is exactly why so many struggle to readjust to civilian life," said the national commander of the American Legion. "When those entrusted with upholding justice show such contempt for military service, it sends a message to every veteran that their sacrifice was meaningless." Social media had amplified the story far beyond what traditional news coverage could have achieved. The hashtag Justice for Torres was trending nationally, with thousands of veterans sharing their own stories of disrespectful treatment by civilian authorities. Active duty military personnel were also speaking out, despite regulations that typically prevented them from commenting on political matters. A video posted by a current Army sergeant had gone viral overnight. In it, the soldier spoke directly to the camera while wearing his dress uniform. "Judge Mansfield, I'm currently deployed in Syria. I'm not playing games. The mortar rounds that landed 50 meters from my position last week weren't pretend. My friend who was wounded by a shrapnel wasn't acting. When I come home, I expect to be treated with the same respect I show this uniform every day." The political implications were also becoming clear. 3 members of Congress had issued statements condemning Mansfield's behavior. Senator Patricia Williams, who served on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, announced she would be calling for a federal investigation into discriminatory treatment of veterans in state court systems. This incident in Judge Mansfield's courtroom may be extreme, but it represents a broader pattern of disrespect that veterans face when they return home, Senator Williams said in a press conference. We need to examine whether this is an isolated incident or part of a systemic problem. Back at the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense and uncomfortable. Court staff members were fielding angry phone calls from the public, and several judges had received threats from people who assumed they supported Mansfield's actions. Security had been increased after threatening messages were left on the court's voicemail system. Chief Judge Rebecca Morrison was trying to manage the crisis while maintaining the court's regular operations. She had known Mansfield for years and had always considered him a competent, if sometimes difficult, colleague. But she had never seen behavior like what had been described in the reports. "I'm calling an emergency meeting of all judges," Morrison told her administrative assistant. "We need to address this situation immediately, and we need to make clear that Judge Mansfield's behavior doesn't represent the values of this court system." Morrison had already been contacted by the state Supreme Court Chief Justice, who was concerned about the negative publicity affecting the entire state judicial system. The pressure to take swift action was enormous, but Morrison also knew that judicial independence required following proper procedures, even in cases of obvious misconduct. At his country club, where Mansfield often went to escape stress, the judge found no refuge. Fellow club members avoided him or made pointed comments about respecting veterans. His regular golf partner had canceled their weekly game, citing scheduling conflicts but making it clear he was uncomfortable being associated with the controversy. "Richard, I served 2 years in Vietnam," one club member told him bluntly. "What you did to that young man was disgraceful. My grandson just enlisted in the Army, and I don't want him thinking this is how his country will treat him when he comes home." Mansfield was beginning to realize that his actions had consequences far beyond his courtroom. The comfortable social world he had built over decades was crumbling around him. Former friends were distancing themselves, professional colleagues were calling for his resignation, and his family was struggling with the embarrassment and anger directed at them by association. That afternoon, Mansfield's attorney called with devastating news. The State Bar Association had opened its own investigation into his conduct, separate from the judicial review process. Legal ethics violations could result in suspension or even disbarment, effectively ending his career. "Richard, I need to be honest with you," his attorney said. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, audio recordings, and a clear pattern of inappropriate behavior. We need to start thinking about damage control and possibly a resignation to minimize the long-term consequences." For the first time since the incident, Mansfield began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. This wasn't going to blow over like previous controversies. The combination of social media amplification, veterans advocacy, and his own recorded words had created a perfect storm that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. Meanwhile, Michael Torres was struggling with his sudden notoriety. Veterans groups wanted him to speak at rallies. Media outlets were requesting interviews. Legal advocates offered to represent him in potential lawsuits against the judge. But Torres just wanted his life to return to normal. "I never asked for any of this," he told his mother as they watched protesters on the news outside the judge's house. "I just wanted to get my license renewed and find a job." His mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mijo, sometimes God puts us in situations where we have to stand up for what's right, even when we don't want to. Maybe this isn't about you anymore. Maybe it's about all the other veterans who will come after you." Torres understood his mother's point, but the attention was overwhelming. He was still dealing with his own readjustment issues, and becoming a public symbol for veterans' rights wasn't something he felt prepared for. As evening approached, the protesters outside Mansfield's house began to disperse, but they promised to return the next day. Veterans groups were organizing a larger demonstration at the courthouse for the weekend. Legal advocacy organizations were preparing formal complaints and lawsuits. The judge who had started his week believing he was untouchable was about to face the full force of a system determined to hold him accountable for his actions. The young veteran he had humiliated was becoming a symbol of everything wrong with how America sometimes treated those who served. Neither man yet realized how much their lives would change in the coming days, or how this single moment of judicial arrogance would reshape both of their futures forever. The following Monday morning brought news that would change everything. As Judge Mansfield prepared to face another day of protests and media attention, he received a phone call that made his blood run cold. The caller was from the State Judicial Conduct Board, informing him that he was being suspended immediately pending a full investigation into his conduct. Judge Mansfield, effective immediately, you are prohibited from presiding over any cases or performing any judicial functions, the board representative explained. You will surrender your judicial credentials to the court administrator by noon today. Mansfield's hands trembled as he hung up the phone. Suspension meant the end of his salary, the loss of his authority, and public acknowledgement that his behavior was unacceptable. After 15 years on the bench, his career was hanging by a thread. But the devastating news didn't stop there. His attorney called 30 minutes later with even worse information. The State Attorney General's office had opened a criminal investigation into whether Mansfield's actions constituted official misconduct and violation of civil rights under color of law. Richard, this has moved beyond a disciplinary matter, his lawyer explained grimly. If they pursue criminal charges, you could face federal prison time. The civil rights violations alone carry a maximum sentence of 10 years. The judge's carefully constructed world was collapsing with breathtaking speed. What had started as what he considered a routine dressing down of an unrespectful defendant had spiraled into a career-ending catastrophe with potential criminal consequences. Meanwhile, Michael Torres was experiencing his own transformation, though in a much more positive direction. The outpouring of support from veterans and civilians alike had been overwhelming. A crowdfunding campaign organized by local veterans had raised over $50,000 to help with his legal fees and living expenses while he searched for employment. More importantly, the attention had led to job opportunities he never could have imagined. 3 different companies had reached out offering positions, impressed not only by his military service, but by his dignity and composure in handling the judge's attack. A local construction company owned by a Navy veteran had offered him a supervisory position with benefits and room for advancement. Mr. Torres, we don't just want to hire you because of what happened in court, explained Bob Richardson, the company owner and former Navy SEAL. We want to hire you because of how you handled yourself. That kind of character and professionalism is exactly what we need in our organization. Torres accepted Richardson's offer, finally, seeing a path forward after months of uncertainty. The job would allow him to support himself and his mother while using the leadership skills he had developed in the military. The veteran had also been approached by the American Civil Liberties Union about filing a federal lawsuit against Judge Mansfield for violating his civil rights. Initially reluctant to pursue legal action, Torres was beginning to see the broader implications of his experience. This isn't just about what happened to me, he told the ACLU attorneys during their meeting. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to other veterans who might not have people willing to speak up for them. Back at the courthouse, the atmosphere remained tense as news of Mansfield's suspension spread through the building. Some staff members felt vindicated, having witnessed his aggressive behavior toward defendants for years. Others worried about the precedent being set and whether it would make judges too cautious in maintaining courtroom order. Chief Judge Morrison called an emergency meeting with all remaining judges to address the crisis and its implications for their court system. What Judge Mansfield did was inexcusable and does not represent the values we stand for, Morrison told her colleagues. However, we cannot let this incident undermine public confidence in our entire judicial system. We must demonstrate that we hold ourselves to the highest standards of conduct and respect for all who appear before us. Judge Rodriguez, who had been among the first to condemn Mansfield's behavior, suggested implementing mandatory training on cultural sensitivity and veteran issues for all court personnel. We need to ensure that our staff understands the unique challenges veterans face and treat them with appropriate respect and consideration. The suggestion was unanimously approved, along with a formal apology to Torres on behalf of the court system. The judges also voted to establish a special veterans court similar to drug courts, designed to address the specific needs of former military personnel facing legal issues. As word of these reforms spread, veterans organizations began to shift their focus from demanding punishment for Mansfield to supporting positive changes in the court system. The American Legion announced it would work with the courts to develop training materials about military culture and veteran issues. The media coverage had also attracted the attention of national figures. A former Secretary of Defense issued a statement supporting Torres and condemning the judge's behavior. Military leaders from all branches of service spoke out about the importance of respecting veterans when they returned to civilian life. Perhaps most significantly, the story had reached the highest levels of government. The president issued a statement during a White House press briefing, praising Torres' service and stating that no veteran should ever be disrespected for their service to our nation, especially by those sworn to uphold justice. The presidential statement sent shockwaves through the legal community and put additional pressure on state officials to take decisive action against Mansfield. The governor of the state called for the judge's immediate resignation, stating that his behavior was incompatible with the dignity and respect required of the judicial office. Meanwhile, the investigation into Mansfield's conduct was uncovering a troubling pattern of behavior that went far beyond his treatment of Torres. Court records revealed dozens of instances where the judge had made inappropriate comments to defendants, shown bias based on race and economic status, and abused his authority to intimidate those who appeared before him. Former defendants began coming forward with their own stories of mistreatment. A single mother who had been publicly humiliated for missing a court date while caring for her sick child. An elderly immigrant who had been mocked for his limited English. A disabled veteran from Vietnam who had been dismissed as a welfare case when seeking accommodation for his service-connected injuries. Judge Mansfield's treatment of Mr. Torres wasn't an isolated incident, explained Janet Walsh, an attorney who had practiced before his court for years. It was part of a pattern of bullying and abuse that many of us witnessed but felt powerless to challenge. The pattern of misconduct made Mansfield's position even more untenable. Legal experts began predicting that he would face not only removal from the bench, but potential criminal charges for violating the civil rights of multiple defendants over several years. The judge's personal life continued to unravel as well. His country club membership was quietly revoked after other members threatened to quit if he remained. His wife Elizabeth filed for separation, unable to handle the public humiliation and constant protests outside their home. His children stopped returning his phone calls, embarrassed by their father's actions and the damage to their own reputations. The financial consequences were also mounting. Without his judicial salary and facing enormous legal bills, Mansfield was forced to put his house up for sale. The protests had made the property difficult to market, and real estate agents warned him that the notoriety would significantly reduce its value. Most devastating of all was the complete collapse of his professional reputation. Former colleagues in the legal community distanced themselves from him, afraid that association with his conduct would damage their own careers. Law firms that might have offered him a position after leaving the bench made it clear he was unwelcome. Richard's behavior has made him toxic in the legal community, explained one prominent attorney who had known Mansfield for 20 years. No reputable firm would take the risk of hiring someone with his baggage. He's essentially unemployable as a lawyer. 3 weeks after the original incident, the State Judicial Conduct Board announced its findings. Judge Richard Mansfield would be permanently removed from the bench for gross misconduct, abuse of judicial authority, and violation of the Judicial Code of Conduct. The decision was unanimous and final. Judge Mansfield's behavior was so far outside the bounds of acceptable judicial conduct that removal is the only appropriate remedy, the board chairman announced at a press conference. His actions brought dishonor to the judicial office and undermined public confidence in our court system. The announcement was met with celebration by veterans groups and relief by court staff who had endured years of Mansfield's abusive behavior. Torres, watching the news coverage from his new job site, felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "I never wanted to destroy anyone's career," he told a reporter. "I just wanted to be treated with respect. But I'm glad that other people won't have to go through what I experienced." The civil rights investigation was also nearing completion, with federal prosecutors indicating they would likely file charges against the former judge. The potential penalties included significant prison time and financial restitution to his victims. But for Torres, the most meaningful outcome was the positive changes being implemented in courts across the state. Dozens of jurisdictions had established veterans' courts or special procedures for handling cases involving former military personnel. Judicial training programs now included modules on veteran issues and cultural sensitivity. "What happened to me was terrible," Torres reflected, "but if it prevents other veterans from being treated that way, then something good came out of it." The young veteran had found more than just a job and financial stability. He had discovered a sense of purpose in advocating for better treatment of veterans in the legal system. Several veterans organizations had asked him to speak at their events, and he was becoming a respected voice in the veteran community. Judge Richard Mansfield, meanwhile, faced a future he could never have imagined. From a position of absolute authority and respect, he had fallen to unemployability and potential imprisonment. His moment of arrogance had cost him everything he had worked to build over decades. The transformation of both men's lives would continue in ways neither could predict, but the foundation had been laid for justice to be served and important changes to be made in the system both had encountered on that fateful morning in court. 6 months after the incident that destroyed his career, Richard Mansfield sat in a modest apartment across town from the mansion he had been forced to sell. The man who had once commanded absolute respect in his courtroom now worked nights as a security guard at a shopping mall, one of the few jobs he could find that didn't require a background check from employers who might recognize his name. The federal criminal case had concluded 2 months earlier with Mansfield pleading guilty to violating civil rights under color of law. The plea agreement had spared him a lengthy prison sentence, but he still faced 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and substantial financial penalties. His law license had been permanently revoked, ensuring he could never practice law again. The former judge's fall from grace had been complete and devastating. The man who had once made 6 figures annually now earned minimum wage and struggled to pay rent on a 1-bedroom apartment. His wife had finalized their divorce, taking half of their remaining assets. His children maintained minimal contact, still embarrassed by his actions and their aftermath. "I never thought it would come to this," Mansfield confided to his court-appointed attorney during one of their final meetings. "I thought I was just maintaining order in my courtroom. I never realized how much damage a few careless words could cause." But Mansfield's attorney had little sympathy for his situation. "Richard, this wasn't about a few careless words. The investigation revealed a pattern of abuse that went on for years. You humiliated dozens of people who were already vulnerable and struggling. Mr. Torres was just the final straw." The attorney was right. During the investigation, 43 former defendants had come forward with complaints about Mansfield behavior. The pattern showed clear bias against minorities, veterans, the poor, and anyone he perceived as beneath his social status. The judge had used his position of authority to bully and demean people who had no recourse to fight back. Meanwhile, Michael Torres had completed a remarkable transformation from struggling veteran to successful advocate and businessman. His construction job with Bob Richardson had led to rapid promotion, and he was now supervising major projects across the region. More importantly, he had found his calling in helping other veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. Torres had established a nonprofit organization called Veterans Voice, which provided support and advocacy for former military personnel facing legal issues. The organization had helped more than 200 veterans in its first 6 months, providing legal representation, counseling services, and job placement assistance. Michael's experience with Judge Mansfield was terrible, but he's turned it into something positive that helps others, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, who had become an advisor to Veterans Voice. He's taken his pain and transformed it into purpose. The nonprofit had attracted significant support from both the veteran community and civilians who had been moved by Torres's story. Major corporations had provided funding, and law firms offered pro bono legal services. The organization had already helped prevent several veteran suicides and had successfully advocated for policy changes in courts across multiple states. Torres had also become a sought-after speaker at veterans events and legal conferences. His message was simple but powerful. Veterans deserved respect and support, not judgment and dismissal. His presentations often brought audiences to tears as he shared not only his own experience, but the stories of other veterans who had faced similar challenges. "I never wanted to become a public figure," Torres told an audience at a judicial training conference. "But I realized that staying silent wouldn't help the next veteran who walked into a courtroom hoping for justice and respect." The changes in the legal system had been substantial and lasting. 47 states had implemented new training requirements for judges and court staff regarding veteran issues. Veterans courts had been established in over 100 jurisdictions, providing specialized treatment for former military personnel facing legal challenges. The American Bar Association had created new ethical guidelines specifically addressing respectful treatment of veterans and other vulnerable populations. Law schools across the country had added courses on judicial ethics that included detailed analysis of the Mansfield case as an example of how judicial misconduct could destroy careers and harm public confidence in the legal system. Chief Judge Rebecca Morrison, who had overseen the reforms in her court system, reflected on the long-term impact of the incident. "What Judge Mansfield did was inexcusable, but it forced us to confront problems in our system that we should have addressed years ago. In some ways, his misconduct led to necessary changes that will benefit everyone who appears in our courts." The political repercussions had also been significant. The incident had contributed to the passage of federal legislation improving support services for veterans and strengthening oversight of judicial conduct. Senator Patricia Williams, who had led the congressional response, credited Torres's courage in speaking out with helping to build support for the reforms. Michael Torres could have quietly accepted what happened to him and moved on with his life, Senator Williams said during the signing ceremony for the new legislation. Instead, he chose to stand up and ensure that other veterans wouldn't face the same disrespect and discrimination. His courage has made a difference for thousands of veterans across our nation. The media coverage had also evolved over time, with Torres' story becoming a symbol of resilience and positive change rather than just judicial misconduct. Documentary filmmakers had approached him about telling his story, and a major publisher had offered a book deal. Torres had declined most of these opportunities, preferring to focus on his advocacy work rather than personal celebrity. As Mansfield prepared to begin his prison sentence, he had tried multiple times to contact Torres to offer a personal apology. Each attempt had been rebuffed, not out of vindictiveness, but because Torres had moved beyond anger and wasn't interested in providing comfort to the man who had humiliated him. "I don't hate Judge Mansfield," Torres explained to a reporter, "but I don't owe him forgiveness or closure. My focus is on the future and helping other veterans, not on making him feel better about his past actions." The veterans' response reflected the maturity and dignity that had impressed so many people throughout the ordeal. Rather than becoming bitter or vengeful, Torres had channeled his experience in a positive action that benefited others. His organization continued to grow, and his influence in veteran advocacy circles expanded steadily. The contrast between the two men's post-incident lives was stark and telling. Mansfield had lost everything through his own arrogance and abuse of power, while Torres had found purpose and success by turning his painful experience into a force for positive change. On the day Mansfield reported to federal prison to begin his sentence, Torres was across the country addressing a conference of federal judges about respectful treatment of veterans in the legal system. The former judge who had played soldier now wore an orange jumpsuit and waited in a processing line with other federal inmates, while the veteran he had mocked received standing ovations from some of the most respected jurists in America. The irony wasn't lost on those who had followed the story from its beginning. In trying to diminish Torres's service and dignity, Mansfield had ultimately elevated both. The young veteran's quiet courage and principled response to injustice had made him a respected voice for change, while the judge's moment of cruelty had cost him everything he valued. As Torres concluded his presentation to the federal judges, he offered a final reflection on his experience. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned through our actions and how we treat others, especially those who are vulnerable or different from ourselves. Every person who appears before your bench deserves dignity and fair treatment, regardless of their background or circumstances. That's what justice really means. The audience rose in unanimous applause, many of the judges thinking about how they could apply Torres's message in their own courtrooms. The young veteran who had walked into court 6 months earlier seeking only basic respect had become a catalyst for meaningful change in the American legal system. Mansfield, meanwhile, began his first night in prison reflecting on how a single moment of arrogance had destroyed a lifetime of work. In trying to demonstrate his power over a young veteran, he had instead revealed his own character flaws and triggered the end of everything he had built. The story that began with judicial abuse of power had become a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the possibility of turning injustice into positive change. Torres had proven that dignity and purpose could emerge from even the most humiliating experiences, while Mansfield had learned that no position of authority protects someone from the consequences of their actions forever. Justice had been served, but more importantly, meaningful change had been created that would benefit countless veterans for years to come. The young soldier's service to his country had continued long after he left the battlefield, just in a way he never could have imagined when he first walked into that courtroom seeking only basic respect and fair treatment under the law.